DPRK soldiers in its territory. The DPRK has sent some 10,000 soldiers to Russia. Russian forces have trained these DPRK soldiers in artillery operations, UAV operations, and basic infantry operations. DPRK soldiers receiving or providing any training or other assistance related to the use of ballistic missiles or other arms is a direct violation of Security Council Resolutions 1718, 1874, and 2270. These latest egregious acts come as Russia and the DPRK continue DPRK weapons to Russia. Russia has DPRK weapons to Russia. Weapons Russia has used against Ukraine, including against civilian targets. We have not yet seen DPRK soldiers deploy into combat against Ukraine's forces, but we expect them to do so in the coming days. The nature of the training Russia is providing to these forces, to include trench clearing, indicates Russia intends to use these forces in frontline operations against Ukraine. They would render themselves legitimate military targets. And let's be clear, if DPRK soldiers do enter into combat, this would demonstrate Russia's growing desperation in its war against Ukraine. It would also demonstrate an unprecedented level of direct military cooperation between Russia and the DPRK, with security implications in Europe as well as in the Indo-Pacific. All members of this Council used to consistently condemn the DPRK's serious and intensifying threat to international peace and security. All members of this Council used to be fully committed to upholding the Security Council resolutions that seek to safeguard international peace and security. But China and Russia now block the Security Council from speaking against the DPRK's behavior. These recent developments threaten us all. Colleagues, all member states have an obligation to faithfully implement the legally binding measures under Security Council resolutions. To my Russian and Chinese colleagues, it is time to stop obstructing and rejoin the rest of us in voicing a united and clear denunciation of the DPRK's behavior, to call on all UN member states to fully and faithfully implement Security Council resolutions, and to work together to prevent the DPRK's procurement activities and revenue flows supporting its unlawful WMD and ballistic missile programs. Colleagues, in response to recent developments, the United States introduced a press statement which sought to condemn DPRK's intercontinental ballistic missile in direct violation of this Council's resolutions. It is unfortunate that Russia and China could not join us in voicing a united denunciation and to uphold the Council's legally binding measures that seek to safeguard international peace and security. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente, je remercie M. Chiari pour son exposé. Le 30 octobre dernier, la Corée du Nord a procédé au lancement d'un missile balistique de portée intercontinentale. Celui-ci aurait atteint une altitude supérieure à 7600 km avant de s'abîmer en mer au large du Japon. La France condamne ce tir, comme l'a fait le secrétaire général des Nations Unies. Nous assurons la Corée du Sud et le Japon de notre pleine solidarité face à cette nouvelle provocation. Ce tir vient s'ajouter à une longue série de violations des résolutions de ce Conseil. Depuis 2022, la Corée du Nord s'est livrée à plus de 100 lancements de missiles balistiques, dont plusieurs de portée intercontinentale, et elle a placé en orbite un satellite militaire en utilisant des technologies balistiques. Dans le même temps, elle n'a cessé de durcir sa rhétorique nucléaire. En septembre 2023, elle inscrivait dans sa constitution la détention de l'arme nucléaire. Le régime nord-coréen s'est vanté que le lancement du 30 octobre avait démontré au monde le caractère irréversible de ses progrès dans la mise au point de vecteurs d'armes nucléaires. Dans ces conditions, qui peut prétendre, comme l'a fait le ministre russe des Affaires étrangères, que la dénucléarisation de la Corée du Nord serait une question close? Depuis des mois,
For
la Russie
months,
accorde à la Corée du
Russia
Nord une
has
couverture
been
diplomatique
providing North Korea with
en
diplomatic
échange de
cover
son
in
soutien
exchange
pour
for
poursuivre
its
sa guerre
support
d'agression
in
contre
continuing
l'Ukraine.
its war of aggression
Des
against
missiles
Ukraine.
balistiques nord-coréens ont
North
déjà
Korean
été
ballistic
livrés à la
missiles have
Russie et
already been
utilisés en
delivered to
Ukraine
Russia and
en
used in
violation des
Ukraine
résolutions de
in
ce
violation
Conseil.
of the resolutions
Nous
of
sommes
this council.
préoccupés
We are
par le récent
concerned by
déploiement
the
en
recent
Russie de
deployment in
troupes
Russia of
nord-coréennes.
North Korean
Il
troops.
représente une escalade
This
dans le
represents
soutien de
an
la Corée du Nord à
escalation in North
l'agression
Korea's
de la Russie.
support for Russia's
La France
aggression.
rappelle que toute
France recalls that
participation de
any
soldats nord-coréens
participation
à une
of
guerre
North Korean
d'agression contre
soldiers
un
in a
État
war of
souverain
aggression against a
serait
sovereign
une
state
violation du droit
would constitute a
international
violation of international
et de la
law
Charte des Nations
and of the
Unies.
United Nations Charter.
En échange de ce soutien, la
In
Russie offre
exchange for this
impunité et
support, Russia
assistance
is
à la Corée
offering
du Nord dans le
impunity and
développement de ses
assistance to North
programmes
Korea in the
illégaux.
development of its
Elle a
illegal
opposé son
programs.
veto au
It
renouvellement
vetoed
du
the
groupe
renewal
d'experts du
of
comité
the panel of
17-18
experts
qui
of the
travaillait depuis plus de
17-18
15 ans
committee
sur les
that has been
violations
working
des
for
sanctions
more than
établies par
15
ce
years on
Conseil.
violations of
Nous
the
ne pouvons
sanctions
que nous
established by
inquiéter
this
des
council.
autres
We cannot help
contreparties
but worry
que
about
Pyongyang
what
pourrait
else
demander
Pyongyang could
en
ask
matière de
for in
coopération militaire et
exchange in the
technologique.
area of military and
Il est
technological
de la
cooperation. It
responsabilité
is
de la
Russia's
Russie de mettre fin
responsibility
dès à présent à ce
to right
rapprochement
away put an
militaire
end to this
illicite et de
illicit
ne pas
military
se
rapprochement
détourner
and
de ses
to not
responsabilités de membre
deviate from
permanent du
its
Conseil de
responsibilities
sécurité.
as a permanent
Le
member of the
renforcement des
Security
programmes
Council.
nucléaires et
Strengthening
balistiques
the
nord-coréens
North Korean ballistic
menace
and
la
nuclear
stabilité de la
programs
péninsule
is a threat
nord-coréenne,
to the stability of the North Korean peninsula.
fragilise le régime international de non-prolifération,
weakens the
met
international
en cause la paix
non-proliferation
et la sécurité
regime,
internationale.
and it
Nul n'y a
undermines
intérêt.
international peace and
Madame
security,
la
and
Présidente,
nobody
la France
needs
appelle une
that.
nouvelle
Madam
fois
President,
la Corée du
once
Nord
again,
et
France
l'ensemble
calls
des
upon
États
North
membres des
Korea
Nations
and all
Unies
the
à
United
se
Nations member
conformer aux
states
obligations
to
édictées par la
comply with the
résolution du
obligations
Conseil de
established in
sécurité.
Security Council
Elle demande à la
resolutions.
Corée du Nord de cesser ses actions
We call upon North Korea
déstabilisatrices,
to end its
de
destabilizing
s'engager
actions
enfin dans la
and
voie du dialogue
at
en
long
vue
last
d'une
to take the path of
dénucléarisation
dialogue with a
complète,
view to the complete,
irréversible et
irreversible and
vérifiable et à
verifiable
donner la priorité au bien-être
denucléarisation
de sa
and to
population
prioritize the
plutôt qu'au
well-being of its
développement de
population
son arsenal
rather than the
nucléaire,
development of its
en
nuclear
accélérant
arsenal
la
by
réouverture de ses
accelerating the
frontières et le
reopening
retour
of
des
its
acteurs
borders and the
humanitaires. Je
return
vous
of
remercie.
humanitarian actors. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I congratulate your assumption of the presidency of the Security Council this month. And also, I thank you for convening this critical meeting requested by 7 Council members, including Japan. And I also thank ASG Carey for the briefing. I must begin with our strong condemnation of yet another launch of an ICBM-class missile by North Korea in violation of multiple Security Council resolutions. The latest ICBM is estimated to have landed in the waters near Japan, around only 200 kilometers from the island of Hokkaido. This ICBM launch is more threatening than ever, as it reached a height of over 7,000 kilometers and a flight time of about 86 minutes, the highest and longest length trajectory of any missile that North Korea has launched to date. Also, its estimated range capability of 15,000 kilometers covers 3/4 of the globe. This launch has deteriorated the not only regional but the entire global security situation even further, and has brought the gravest threat yet from North Korea to all citizens of the region and beyond. I reiterate the launches of ballistic missiles by North Korea are undermining the international peace and security that the UN Charter has given this Council the primary responsibility to maintain. I urge all Council members to reaffirm our commitment to the Charter, the supreme instrument of the world peace, and to express a united and strong response to this unprovoked incident. Madam President, let me take this opportunity to stress the fact that North Korea continues to develop its unlawful nuclear and ballistic missile programs, unabatedly violating Security Council resolutions. Half a year has passed since the UNSC's 1780 Committee panel of experts was forced to terminate its mandate due to the regrettable veto by Russia. Since then, its military cooperation with North Korea has stepped up, including a recent development of North Korea's troops being dispatched to Russia. We cannot just be silent as we see continued violations and evasions of Security Council resolutions across a variety of arenas. Thus, Japan, together with like-minded countries, decided to launch a new mechanism, the Multilateral Sanctions Monitoring Team, with a view to filling the significant void that POE has left behind and to assisting the full implementation of relevant Council resolutions. Madam President, we have just discussed this issue last week, but I once again have to raise the point that the military cooperation between Russia and North Korea poses a great concern to the international community. We have seen the malfunction of Russia's procurement of ballistic missiles from North Korea, as well as the training of North Korean soldiers, both of which constitute serious violations of relevant Security Council resolutions, and North Korea's involvement in Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine would constitute a grave violation of international law, including the UN Charter. We carefully listened to the Russia and North Korea's delegations last week at the Security Council meeting on maintaining peace and security in Ukraine, where they said their cooperation can be justified as a right of sovereign states, but this recent unlawful military cooperation will never be justified in any case, at any time, anywhere in the world. Madam President, North Korea has continued to ignore and deny its obligations by pursuing its military ambition at the expense of the welfare of people in North Korea, even amidst their great unmet needs. We also should not ignore, including those of abductees of Japan and detainees of the Republic of Korea. I conclude by once again strongly urging North Korea not to conduct further launches and to immediately and fully comply with all relevant Security Council resolutions, as well as to engage in diplomacy and accept the repeated offers of dialogue. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, Madam President, and I begin on congratulating you on assuming the presidency of the Security Council and by thanking Switzerland for steering our work in October. I also thank ASG Chiari for his informative and sobering briefing today. Madam President, Madam President, Malta joined the request for this meeting following the latest provocation by the DPRK. We firmly believe that this Council must stand united in condemning such dangerous acts, which constitute blatant violations of Security Council resolutions. Last week, the DPRK tested a solid-fuel intercontinental ballistic missile. It reportedly flew for 86 minutes, the longest ever recorded by the DPRK. It also seems to have reached an altitude of over 7,000 kilometers. This means that if launched at a wider angle, such a missile could reach any place on Earth. This is a deeply worrisome advancement in the DPRK's unlawful ballistic missile program, and it cannot go unanswered. Malta strongly condemns this latest ICBM test by the DPRK. We also condemn the deployment of troops and provision of arms to Russia in support of its war of aggression against Ukraine, in violation of the UN Charter and the fundamental principles of international law. Such actions are also in violation of multiple Security Council resolutions and pose a grave threat to peace and stability in the peninsula and beyond. When Council members came together to collectively tackle this grave threat to non-proliferation, a comprehensive set of sanctions was put in place. In contrast, the latest developments demonstrates that the Council's inaction emboldens the DPRK. Earlier this year, the mandate of the 1718 Committee panel of experts was terminated. Since then, the DPRK's dangerous actions have gone unchecked. Although the panel is gone, nevertheless, sanctions remain in place and must continue to be fully implemented by all member states. Any transfer of weapons, ammunition, and related technology to and from the DPRK is illegal and must be condemned. Once more, we urge the DPRK to cease its unlawful and dangerous behavior, engage in meaningful dialogue, and immediately comply with its obligations under Security Council resolutions. It must completely, verifiably, and irreversibly abandon its nuclear and ballistic missile program and return immediately to the full compliance with the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. Madam President, it is regrettable that the DPRK continues to prioritize its military build-up over the well-being of its people. Not only is its unlawful WMD program developed and accelerated through grave human rights violations, but the regime's scarce resources are being diverted from addressing the real needs of the population. Malta remains deeply concerned about the dire humanitarian situation in the country, with over 10 million people in need of assistance. We commend the work of the 1718 Committee, which aims to curb the DPRK's military ambitions while addressing the humanitarian needs of the population by establishing a mechanism for granting humanitarian exemptions. We reiterate our call on the DPRK to allow the UN and other agencies into the country to provide much-needed humanitarian assistance. To conclude, Madam President, we once again reaffirm the need for a comprehensive and lasting peace in the Korean Peninsula. To achieve this, the Council must be united and send an unequivocal message to the DPRK. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank ASG Mr. Chiari for his briefing. Colleagues, we gather once again in this chamber after we discussed DPRK's dispatch of troops to Russia last month and called on Russia and DPRK to stop illegal military cooperation. However, our repeated calls for restraint were once again ignored by Pyongyang. North Korea launched another ICBM right after our meeting last Wednesday. Its intention could be to distract the world's attention from its troops in Russia, demonstrate themselves as larger than life, or gain diplomatic leverage amid the U.S. presidential election. Regardless of the intention, it was clearly an attempt to advance its missile technology, which makes the launch another flagrant violation of multiple Security Council resolutions. The Republic of Korea condemns it in the strongest possible terms. Madam President, with its new solid fuel ICBM, the so-called Hwasong-19, the DPRK broke the record of its previous ICBM launches in terms of flight time, 86 minutes, and apogee, about 7,700 kilometers. Kim Jong-un, 700 kilometers. Kim Jong-un himself oversaw the launch at the site and said that, I quote, "The DPRK will never change its policy of strengthening its nuclear forces," unquote. This launch once again raises a fundamental question. How can an impoverished prior regime continue to develop such diverse ballistic missile programs despite the rigorous sanctions regime, Security Council sanctions regime? The answer is that there must be large loopholes enabling the DPRK's access to the equipment, materials, and technology necessary to advance its WMD programs. Some may point out that the DPRK's nuclear and ballistic missile program is an exemplary case of the Security Council's failure. However, it is indeed a textbook case which demonstrates what the world will face when member states do not fully implement Security Council resolutions. Madam President, upon joining the Security Council last January, we proposed to update the prohibited items lists related to the NSG, Nuclear Suppliers Group, and MTCR, Missile Technology Control Regime, pursuant to Resolution 2087 and 2094, which had been neglected for the past several years. The lists are directly aimed at curbing North Korea's WMD program. It doesn't impose additional sanctions. However, after months of deliberations, the 1718 Committee failed to update the lists due to the opposition by 2 permanent members of the Security Council. This is a good example of how large loopholes are created in the DPRK sanctions regime. Madam President, we already saw Russia dissolve the 1718 Committee panel of experts. Then we also heard the Russian foreign minister saying that he considers the denuclearization of the DPRK to be a closed case. I have a very simple question. Cui bono? Obviously, it is the DPRK and Russia who have been continuing their illegal arms deals. The DPRK is the only country that has conducted nuclear tests this century. Not once, but already 6 times. It is also the only country that abused the NPT regime by joining, then violating the treaty from within, and then announcing its withdrawal from the treaty. And no other UN member states rejected Security Council resolutions so shamelessly as the DPRK. Once the NPT regime begins to erode and ultimately collapses, it will be extremely difficult to restore it. The repercussion will have a deep and lasting impact on international peace and security, and the permanent members of the Security Council will not be immune to it either. In this regard, we would like to bring to the attention of other member states that the MSMT, Multilateral Sanctions Monitoring Team, a newly established multilateral mechanism to replace the 1718 Committee panel of experts, will assist the full implementation of UN sanctions on the DPRK by monitoring and reporting violations thereof. The Republic of Korea calls on all member states to join such international efforts to fill in the gap created by Russia's veto on the renewal of the panel's mandate. Madam President, since I'm sure that the DPRK representative will soon repeat the erroneous and misleading arguments underpinned by the so-called DPRK's security dilemma caused by the US and ROK, let me shed some light on the fallacies of that groundless narrative often echoed by the DPRK and its few friends. The reality that North Korea has faced for a long time is in fact not a security dilemma, but the regime survival dilemma. It is about the constant struggle to sustain the family dynasty spanning through 3 generations. Pyongyang goes to great lengths, taking extreme and draconian measures to keep afloat the world's most bizarre dictatorship, fully aware that it is ultimately unsustainable. That is why the and imposes the worst totalitarian ideology on its own people, while simultaneously isolating itself from the outside world. To that end, the regime has to fabricate and reinforce, anti-US, anti-ROK narratives, and relentlessly develop nuclear weapons to take on the far more advanced opponents. Recently, we see more desperate and dangerous moves by Pyongyang. Earlier this year, the DPRK leader, Kim Jong-un, redefined the ROK. Its fellow nations sharing the same culture, heritage, and language for thousands of years, suddenly as a foreign state overnight. Last month, they completely cut off the existing railways and roads linking the South and North by detonating them. We know why. The regime has always feared direct contact with the outside world, in particular its neighboring free and prosperous fellow nation. It fears what will happen if North Koreans continue to compare themselves with the desperate DPRK demanding more sacrifices from its own people by dispatching troops to Russia. The North Korean foreign minister even referred to Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a just and holy war. During her visit to Moscow last week. The union of these 2 desperate nations is exceptionally alarming especially as they repeatedly disregard the UN Charter, violate the Security Council resolutions, and even possess nuclear weapons. The international community, including the Republic of Korea, stands ready to help the DPRK. But without solving its own regime survival dilemma, the DPRK cannot extricate itself from the abyss. Provocations and the pursuit of nuclear and ballistic missile programs will only aggravate Pyongyang's hardship and dilemma. Pyongyang's friends must help the DPRK help themselves. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Nous remercions le sous-secrétaire général Chiari pour son exposé et saluons la participation de la République populaire démocratique de Corée à nos délibérations. La Suisse condamne le lancement d'un missile balistique de portée intercontinentale, apparemment d'un nouveau type qui serait capable de transporter de multiples ogives nucléaires. Le développement et l'opérationnalisation continue de vecteurs nucléaires par la RPDC représentent avec son programme nucléaire, une menace pour toute la communauté internationale. Ce test s'inscrit dans une situation sécuritaire tendue et la Suisse est préoccupée par le risque d'escalade inhérent à un tel acte. L'emploi d'armes nucléaires provoquerait des conséquences humanitaires catastrophiques. Nous devons renforcer nos efforts en faveur de la non-prolifération, du désarmement et du maintien du tabou nucléaire. Face à ces défis répétés, nous ne saurions fléchir de notre devoir collectif. C'est pourquoi ce Conseil doit assumer ses responsabilités. Je tiens à en souligner trois aspects. Premièrement, ces tirs sont une violation de résolutions juridiquement contraignantes du Conseil de sécurité et donc du droit international. Il est ainsi de notre devoir collectif de condamner les essais de missiles balistiques que la RPDC. Celle-ci est tenue de mettre en œuvre ses obligations envers
The DPRK is obliged to implement its obligations under the resolutions of this Council and to take concrete steps towards the complete, verifiable and irreversible abandonment of its nuclear weapons, ballistic missiles and related programs. We recall that while the obligation arising from the resolutions apply first and foremost to the DPRK, they also apply to all other states which are required to effectively implement the Security Council sanctions. In this respect, we are deeply concerned by reports of possible serious violations of Security Council resolutions by Russia, which we referred to last week. Secondly, the people of the DPRK must not be left behind. Serious and systematic human rights violations and the impunity of the perpetrators must stop. There is a link between the nuclear program and certain violations of these rights, and the Council should consider how it might further address this link. We welcome signs that the DPRK is easing its heavy restrictions in connection with the pandemic. These restrictions should no longer be a major obstacle to humanitarian assistance. The opening of the DPRK's borders must go hand in hand with rapid, safe and unhindered access for humanitarian aid. To achieve this, the entry of international personnel into the DPRK is essential. Thirdly, the Council and the United Nations as a whole has an important role to play in encouraging diplomatic solutions. There is a willingness to engage in dialogue with the DPRK and to support these dialogue efforts, and we welcome any attempts at exchanges between the parties and any de-escalation measures on their part. We encourage recourse to the Secretary General's good offices and call on the DPRK to engage in constructive dialogue with the Council and the UN system. Madam President, disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation have always been a priority for the UN and this Council, and in the framework of the Compact for the Future, we have all committed ourselves to strengthening them and preventing any erosion of existing international norms. We must not fail in this task. To find a political solution, the Council must break its silence. To be effective, any call for dialogue must be founded on a unified stance. Switzerland encourages and supports all efforts in this direction. For its part, Switzerland will continue its commitment within the Council, the Sanctions Committee, and on the ground to a denuclearized and peaceful Korean Peninsula. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Assistant Secretary General Khalid Kiari for his briefing and welcome the participation of the representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in this meeting. Guyana condemns the ongoing violations of UN Security Council resolutions. We remain alarmed by the continued launches of ballistic missiles by the DPRK in violation of relevant Security Council resolutions, including the recent launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile on the 30th of October. We note with concern that these launches not only increase the security threat to neighboring countries, but also serve to undermine the global non-proliferation regime. Madam President, we have seen in recent months the catastrophic consequences following escalations of tensions in other regions and underscore the need to avoid a similar situation occurring on the Korean Peninsula and the region at large. In this regard, Guyana once again calls upon the parties to engage in dialogue and diplomacy towards resolving the tensions and ensuring peace on the peninsula. We urge the government of the DPRK to comply fully with all Council resolutions and to abandon its ballistic missile program, along with all other existing weapons of mass destruction in a complete, verifiable, and irreversible manner. Guyana remains firm in its conviction that the only way to prevent the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is through their total elimination. We reiterate our belief that the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is key to achieving this objective and is critical for the furtherance of international peace and security. Allow me to conclude by reaffirming Guyana's firm commitment to the implementation of the Security Council resolutions relating to the DPRK, including through support for the work of the 1718 Sanctions Committee. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to start by thanking the United Kingdom's presidency for convening this briefing and extend our appreciation to the United States, France, Japan, Malta, Republic of Korea, Slovenia, and UK for requesting this session. I also wish to thank Mr. Khalid Kiari, Assistant Secretary General for Middle East, Asia, and the Pacific for his comprehensive briefing on the topic under consideration. We acknowledge the presence of the representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea at this meeting. Madam President, the complex dynamics of the situation on the Korean Peninsula necessitates careful and measured actions. We must emphasize that any unilateral measures and inflammatory rhetoric will only serve to escalate tensions. The latest developments and reports indicate that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea has conducted a test launch of an advanced new intercontinental ballistic missile, achieving unprecedented altitude and flight duration compared to previous launches. Subsequently, the United States, South Korea, and Japan have conducted trilateral military exercise to demonstrate their preparedness and determination to address North Korea's advancing missiles programs. These concerning developments have prompted increased scrutiny and condemnation from the international community, further escalating regional tensions. This situation highlights the urgent need for enhanced international cooperation and renewed commitment to diplomatic solutions. In this context, Mozambique urgently calls for and encourages genuine dialogue and mutual understanding among the parties to reduce tensions and build trust, essential for achieving lasting stability in the Korean Peninsula and the broader region. Madam President, while the immediate focus of this briefing centers on the Korean Peninsula, we must acknowledge that the broader discourse on non-proliferation and denuclearization among member states has acquired unprecedented urgency, as diminishing trust between nations has led to accelerated nuclear militarization, posing a grave threat to international peace and security. The Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons remains the fundamental framework for global efforts to prevent the nuclear weapons proliferation and advance disarmament objectives. The potential of nuclear weapons and the devastating consequences of nuclear war remain unequivocally clear to the international community. To this end, it is imperative to comprehensively address the underlying political, security, and humanitarian dimension through diplomacy and constructive dialogue, while remaining cognizant of the legitimate security concerns of all parties. The ultimate goal of complete denuclearization requires genuine and sustained engagement from all parties. We therefore hope that diplomatic efforts will gain traction and ultimately yield enduring peace in the Korean Peninsula and beyond. The Security Council and its members should play a crucial role in facilitating this process. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, President, and we are grateful to ASG Chiari for his informative briefing. Ecuador condemns the recent launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, as did the Secretary General and the vast majority of the international community. My delegation stands in solidarity with the peoples of the Republic of Korea and Japan, given the risks they are facing with these types of launches. This most recent launch, given its duration and trajectory, confirms an improvement in the DPRK capacity in the development of ballistic missiles. This is alarming. Ballistic missile tests represent a serious threat to international peace and security. Moreover, they are a clear violation of multiple Security Council resolutions, including resolutions 1718, 1874, and 2397. They are completely unjustifiable, and they must not become a common occurrence. This Council cannot remain indifferent in the face of these provocative acts which threaten regional and international stability. Ecuador has seen how this issue has been dealt with over the past 2 years, and we note a lack of consistency and a lack of unified voice within this Council in what must be a rejection of non-compliance with its resolutions. I therefore respectfully urge those members with greater influence on the DPRK to restore commitment by all parties to avoid exacerbating tensions. Ecuador reaffirms its commitment to the principles of the UN Charter, particularly disarmament and the global nuclear non-proliferation architecture. Complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula today is more urgent than ever. For that reason, I would conclude by reiterating Ecuador's appeal to the DPRK to abandon its nuclear and ballistic missile programs and to resume the path of cooperation and dialogue in good faith and diplomacy. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me also thank Mr. Khaled Kiari, Assistant Secretary General for the Middle East, Asia and the Pacific, for his concise briefing. We welcome the participation of the representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in this meeting. Sierra Leone is concerned about the Democratic People's Republic of Korea's recent launch of an ICBM, the Hwasong-19, with a capability and range that poses serious regional and global security. Higher in altitude and flew longer for a total of 86 minutes, more than any previous attempt, is also deeply concerning. Additionally, statements by the DPRK state officials are especially troubling, including by the head of state, referring to the weapon as its final and ultimate ICBM, quote-unquote, final and ultimate ICBM, quote-unquote, and that, quote-unquote, the DPRK will never change its line of bolstering up its nuclear forces. The current situation in the Korean Peninsula remains highly volatile, with potential for further escalation. The DPRK's long-range missile and nuclear programs continue to pose serious challenges to peace and security in the region. From further escalatory measures and to engage in constructive dialogue aimed at de-escalation. The international community should remain committed to upholding peace and security in the region. We call upon all parties involved to prioritize diplomatic efforts and to work collaboratively towards a lasting resolution that addresses the underlying tensions. We also call on states with influence to engage DPRK authorities on working towards solutions for lasting peace in the Korean Peninsula. Sierra Leone is of the firm view that a strong and unified Council response to the latest missile launch will reinforce our commitment to denuclearization and a peaceful resolution of conflicts, particularly in the Korean Peninsula. We stand ready to support all diplomatic initiatives and encourage the DPRK to engage, equivocally commit to transparent, complete, verifiable, irreversible, and non-discriminatory nuclear disarmament. The DPRK's blatant disregard and open violation of Security Council resolutions and the UN Charter undermines the authority of the organizations and remains a significant challenge for the international community. While efforts over the years have not succeeded in convincing authorities to comply with the global safeguards and de facto international norm against nuclear testing, a strong independent verification mechanism is still necessary to ensure that the DPRK meets its international obligations. In this regard, we wish to recall the importance of the work and report of the panel of experts and the regrettable non-renewal of the panel's mandate. We take note of the creation of the Multilateral Sanctions Monitoring Team for implementation of the UN Security Council resolutions regarding the DPRK, with the stated goal to assist with the full implementation of UN sanctions on the DPRK by publishing information based on rigorous inquiry into sanctions violations and evasion attempts. Additionally, we reiterate our call for the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty's entry into force, noting its valuable contribution to halting further modernization, an increase in vertical and horizontal proliferation of nuclear weapons, thereby advancing the goal of nuclear disarmament. We conclude, Madam President, by echoing our previous call for the need for a holistic and comprehensive assessment of the nuclear programs of the DPRK, drawing upon the global effort for non-proliferation to promote international peace and security. As Sierra Leone reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the principles of disarmament, non-proliferation, and international peace and security, we reiterate our support for diplomatic efforts towards complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization of the DPRK and the Korean Peninsula. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I also wish to thank Under-Secretary General Chiari for his briefing. Let me make a couple of points on behalf of my delegation. One, Slovenia strongly condemns the October 31st launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile by the DPRK. This is a blatant violation of multiple Security Council resolutions. DPRK has demonstrated numerous times it simply does not care about Security Council actions. A country who illegally developed nuclear weapons and has demonstrated with the latest launch that it can deliver them virtually anywhere in the Northern Hemisphere. This is a clear and provocative threat to peace and security in the region and worldwide. The Security Council resolutions are binding and must be implemented. They are not guidelines that can be unilaterally dropped when they do not fit the contemporary political agenda. DPRK must ensure their implementation, abandon its WMD and ballistic missile programs in a complete, verifiable, and irreversible manner, and cease all related activities. 2. Slovenia is gravely concerned with the trajectory the North Korean non-proliferation issue is taking. Throughout the last year, the situation grew consistently worse. The DPRK showed ever greater disregard for rules and has continued with ballistic missile tests and satellite launches. The work of the 1718 panel of experts was single-handedly put to an end with a veto. Evidence of DPRK origin ballistic missile use in Ukraine surfaced. Deeply concerning statements about DPRK's nuclear status were uttered. And to top everything off, reports of DPRK troops deployment to Europe emerged. We desperately need a change of course. It would be too easy to point a finger just at one member of this Council, whose actions have been particularly damaging to the situation. However, I'm looking at all the Council members here. It is our collective responsibility to uphold international peace and security, and DPRK's activities are clearly undermining it. Madam President, the status quo we are experiencing is conducive to nothing but the expansion of DPRK's illegal nuclear weapons and ballistic missile program. It is our duty to employ all diplomatic means to bring the DPRK back to the negotiating table. It is high time for DPRK to cease its provocative activities and return to dialogue and diplomacy. There is no legitimate alternative to this. The sooner we all realize this, the faster we will be able to comprehensively address the imperative of DPRK's denuclearization. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. I congratulate the United Kingdom for assuming the presidency of the Security Council for this month. I thank ASD Chiari for his briefing and welcome the presence of the permanent representative of the DPRK at today's meeting. China has taken note of the recent launch by the DPRK and its relevant statements, as well as the reactions of other parties. The current situation on the peninsula remains tense,
with growing antagonism and confrontation, which is not in the interest of any party. As a close neighbor of the peninsula, China hopes for peace and stability on the peninsula and does not wish to see any turbulence or even war and chaos there. China calls on all parties to bear in mind the overall peace and stability on the peninsula and the world at large, exercise calm and restraint, avoid intensifying and escalating tension, and make joint efforts to promote a de-escalation of the situation as soon as possible. President, the long-standing and complex issue of the peninsula is in essence a security issue. Its root cause is the Cold War vestiges, the absence of a peace mechanism, and the lack of mutual trust between the United States and the DPRK. It is imperative for all parties to take a rational and pragmatic approach and work to build mutual trust so as to create a conducive atmosphere for de-escalating the situation. To fundamentally resolve the peninsula issue, China, upholding impartiality and objectivity, proposed a dual-track approach and the principle of phased and synchronized steps, which remains realistic and feasible under the current situation. Regrettably, a second country obsessed with the Cold War mentality and zero-sum game has been vigorously pursuing its geopolitical strategies, strengthening military alliances and provoking bloc confrontation. These moves run counter to the historic mission of realizing the transition from armistice to a peace mechanism on the peninsula and to the common aspiration of regional countries for stability, cooperation, and development. It is particularly important to note that the United States, while claiming that it wants to uphold the international nuclear non-proliferation regime and denuclearize the peninsula, has continued to increase the deployment of its strategic forces, strengthen the extended deterrence arrangement on the peninsula, and even transferred tons of weapon-grade, highly enriched uranium to non-nuclear weapon state under AUKUS Nuclear Submarine Cooperation Framework. The United States has also deployed intermediate-range missile system in the Philippines and seeks to further expand the deployment to Northeast Asia. These moves are tantamount to pushing the threat to the doorstep of China and other countries in the region, seriously jeopardizing regional security and upsetting the strategic security balance. We urge the United States to immediately seize these dangerous and wrong moves and to withdraw and abandon relevant deployment. President, China always believes that the Security Council should play a constructive role on the peninsula issue and take concrete measures to de-escalate the situation and enhance mutual trust, rather than simply imposing sanctions and pressure. Under the current circumstances, the Security Council needs unity, not division. It needs to promote dialogue, not to profess itself just for the sake of doing so, and still less to intensify antagonism. The countries concerned should come up with concrete actions and feasible proposals and make effective efforts to advance the political settlement of the peninsula issue, rather than using the Security Council to intensify confrontation. I wish to reiterate that a peaceful and stable Korean peninsula serves the common interests of all parties concerned and meets the wide expectation of the international community. China, as a close neighbor of the peninsula and a responsible major country, will continue to play a constructive role in its own way in maintaining peace and stability on the peninsula and the UN realizing lasting peace and stability in Northeast Asia. I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we welcome the participation in the meeting of the permanent representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. We listened to the briefing by Assistant Secretary General Khaled Kiari. We are forced to note that, once again, it did not provide any real substantive evaluation of events. In Korean affairs, the collective West is methodically using the Security Council to present Pyongyang as being responsible
responsible for the deteriorating situation on the peninsula. In creating this distorted picture, the UN Secretariat has also played a role by ignoring the external context of events. Even in the current so acute phase of developments on the Korean peninsula, UN officials prefer to repeat the same argument, criticizing Pyongyang while turning a blind eye to provocations by its opponents. In so doing, they are becoming complicit in this negative turn of events.
Не ожидали и не услышали мы ничего нового от группы стран, запросивших сегодняшнее заседание. Цель созыва каждый раз одна и та же – сделать еще один шаг к демонизации КНДР. Нам было бы интересно послушать от самих инициаторов о влиянии хоть одного такого заседания на урегулирование проблем полуострова. Может быть, из их уст за этот период прозвучало хоть одно конструктивное предложение, нацеленная на создание условий для запуска диалога. Ответ очевиден каждому в этом зале. Создание вокруг Пхеньяна негативного информационного шума, удержание на плаву неработающих санкционных мер, оправдание агрессивных шагов США и их союзников в регионе – вот истинные мотивы инициаторов заседания. Хочу только напомнить, что к мандату Совета Безопасности эти задачи не имеют никакого отношения. Напротив, подобными действиями наши коллеги лишь прямо подрывают деятельность Совета Безопасности, который, согласно Уставу ООН, призван поддерживать международный мир и безопасность. Вашингтон и другие заинтересованные страны могли бы с таким же успехом продолжить вести свою пропагандистскую работу через подконтрольные СМИ и НПО. Госпожа председатель, ракетные испытания, вызывающие такое волнение в Вашингтоне, Токио и Сеуле, происходят не на пустом месте, не в пресловутом вакууме. Их нельзя рассматривать отдельно от агрессивных планов американцев и их сателлитов в регионе, а именно от масштабных военных маневров, сопровождаемых размещением американского стратегического потенциала, совместного ядерного планирования США и Республики Корея с отработкой ядерных ударов по территории КНДР, выстраивание военно-политического треугольника Вашингтон-Сеул-Токио. Давайте посмотрим на действия США и их союзников в Северо-Восточной Азии только за последние недели. 28 октября начались беспрецедентные по своему охвату военные учения ВВС США, Австралии и Республики Корея в рамках данных маневров задействованы сотни единиц авиатехники, сухопутные силы, морская пехота и спецназ. Параллельно в Республике Корея продолжаются крупнейшие учения национальных вооруженных сил КУГУ с подключением Америки в сторону КНДР, продолжают вестись опасные провокации в сторону КНДР, продолжают вестись опасные провокации с применением военных дронов, совершивших за последние 3 месяца более 230 вылетов в северокорейское воздушное пространство в нарушение суверенитета страны. Указанные агрессивные меры ведутся в дополнение к ставшим уже регулярными учениям под названием Freedom Shield. Стоит напомнить, что в рамках этих маневров последовательно отрабатываются сценарии гипотетического вооруженного конфликта с применением ядерного оружия и физического устранения северокорейского руководства. Помимо военных кампаний, противники Пхеньяна продолжают оказывать на него всевозможное политическое и экономическое давление, нарушение Устава ООН. Долгие годы незаконные западные односторонние санкции напрямую ухудшают положение простых людей. Рестрикции Совета застыли во времени и не отражают проблем полуострова. Все предложения со стороны России и Китая по актуализации мер СБ неоднократно отвергались и продолжают отвергаться как несоответствующие американским интересам по планомерному удушению Пхеньяна. Сожалеем, что наши многолетние друзья и партнеры в Сеуле стремительно утрачивают независимость под нажимом Вашингтона, ставя под удар собственные национальные интересы. Судя по всему, они стали втягиваться и в опасные авантюры Вашингтона по наращиванию поставок западного оружия Киеву, который на фоне своих боевых потерь очень в нем нуждается. Характерно, что именно украинская тема стала одной из основных в ходе консультаций советников по нацбезопасности США, Японии, Южной Кореи 25 октября в Кэмп-Дэвидском формате. Получается, что проводя агрессивную политику на Корейском полуострове, американцы заодно решают свои задачи по мобилизации союзников против России. Это многое говорит об истинных мотивах США в отношении субрегиона. Призываем южнокорейских коллег одуматься и не вставать на крайне опасный путь, который ни к чему хорошему Сеул не приведет. Тем более, что по данным южнокорейских исследований, уверенное большинство населения страны не поддерживает отправку вооружений на Украину. Госпожа председатель, политика создания управляемой напряженности на Корейском полуострове преподносится властями в Вашингтоне как рутинные мероприятия по обеспечению безопасности США и их союзников. Однако американские власти не хотят признавать простую истину о том, что безопасность одного государства не может обеспечиваться за счет безопасности другого. Ни в Европе, ни в Азии. Руководство КНДР имеет полное право на применение мер по обеспечению безопасности и суверенитета своей страны. Заключенный 19 июня договор о всеобъемлющем стратегическом партнерстве между нашими странами призван сыграть в регионе стабилизирующую роль на основе принципа недвижимости безопасности, снизить риск рецидива войны на полуострове, в том числе с применением ядерных средств, стать одним из элементов устойчивой архитектуры безопасности в регионе. Положение договора, включая статью 4 о взаимной поддержке в случае вооруженного нападения, при необходимости будут выполнены в полном объеме. Соглашение соответствует уставу ООН, а меры, которые могут быть предприняты в его реализации, дело российско-северокорейских двусторонних отношений. Не намерены мы поддерживать и несбалансированные инициативы в Совете Безопасности, выстроенные на базе осуждения КНДР или возложения на нее исключительной ответственности за обострение кризиса на полуострове. Госпожа председатель, неудивительно, что некоторые члены СБ сегодня вновь повторяли свои спекуляции относительно направления в Россию неких подразделений северокорейских военнослужащих. Причем в сообщениях подконтрольных Западу СМИ цифры растут день ото дня, видимо, вместе с увеличивающимся страхом и беспокойством этих стран. Отметился сбивающим с толку заявлением насчет этих сообщений и генсекретарь ООН. Удивительно, что подыгрывая сейчас западным странам в интернационализацию украинского конфликта, он никогда не высказывался с такой же озабоченностью о постоянно наращиваемой номенклатуре все более дальнобойных западных вооружений Украине. В дискуссиях о том, можно или нельзя бить в глубину российской территории, не говоря уже о практике отправки военнослужащих армий стран НАТО в зону конфликта на Украине. И это при том, что хорошо известно, что там находятся сотни, если не тысячи натовских военных, причем не наемников, а инструкторов и офицеров, ответственных за использование высокоточного оружия или вооруженных беспилотников в Черном море. Или видел ли кто-нибудь заявление секретариата ООН с озабоченностью поставками американского оружия в зону Палестино-израильского конфликта? Западные страны повторяют свои тезисы о том, что это вопиющие двойные стандарты и столь наглая демонстрация исключительности и вседозволенности хорошо видны всему международному сообществу. Возвращаясь же к ситуации на Корейском полуострове, хотели бы вновь констатировать
we would once again like to note that the Security Council must fundamentally revise its approaches in order to get the situation out of this dangerous deadlock and not make it worse. We have repeatedly said where we could begin this movement towards normalization, but in order for that to happen, in Western capitals there needs to be a fundamental change in their way of thinking, which in intellectual terms is stuck somewhere in the Cold War era. This is indicated in particular by the attempts of a narrow group of countries to breathe some life into the so-called unified command, which is a stillborn relic of a bygone era. And similarly, there are all sorts of Western-centric gatherings and groupings that are themselves giving themselves regulatory and monitoring functions, including to the detriment of the charter prerogatives of the Security Council. All of this is a demonstration of the chronic flaws of Western colonial policy in Asia, which it must abandon. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
I thank you, Madam President. First, I'd like to express our sincere appreciation to Mr. Khaled Khiari, and we thank him for his briefing. I would also like to welcome the permanent representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in this meeting. The recent developments in the Korean Peninsula reflect the modern complexities as the behavior of one party lead to repercussions that affect others, and where security fears intermingle with humanitarian need, and where the path towards peace grows more and more convoluted. Madam President, the launching of an intercontinental ballistic missile on the 31st of October has caused widespread fears among the international community, and this has deepened tensions in a region that is already clearly fragile and threatened the foundations of the non-proliferation framework. However, it is important to look at the bigger picture.
نحو التسلح المتزايد في المنطقة والتحركات العسكرية الواسعة ونشر المعدات الاستراتيجية كلها عوامل تسهم في إشعال حلقة من التصعيد لا تخدم مصالح أي طرف. نحن نشهد اتجاها قد يؤدي إلى تصعيد غير قابل للتحكم في تداعياته، ونلاحظ تصعيدا يهدد بانفجار الوضع في منطقة بأكملها، كما نرى وضعا إنسانيا يتطلب تدخلا عاجلا. سيد الرئيس، علمنا التاريخ أن النزاعات لها كلفة باهظة، وأن الحوار أيضا يحمل في طياته قدرة على إحداث التحول المنشود. ثلاثة مبادئ رئيسية ينبغي أن توجه مسارنا نحو المستقبل في هذه القضية. أولا، التصعيد العسكري لن يؤدي إلى الحل المنشود. ثانيا، العقوبات وحدها لا يمكن أن تخلق سلاما مستداما. ثالثا، الحوار مهما بدا صعبا يظل الوسيلة الأقوى لتحقيق الحل. للأسف الواقع الذي نواجهه التوترات العسكرية في تصاعد مستمر، الاحتياجات الإنسانية تتفاقم وتصبح أكثر إلحاحا، القنوات الدبلوماسية غير مستغلة كما يجب، والمدنيون هم من يتحملون العبء الأكبر. يجب أن يتغير هذا الواقع، وفي هذا الإطار ينبغي اتخاذ خطوات عملية تضمن ما يلي. أولا، يجب على جميع الأطراف العمل على تخفيف التوترات وتقليل الأنشطة العسكرية فورا في المنطقة. ثانيا، ينبغي استئناف الاتصالات الدبلوماسية وفتح باب الحوار دون شروط مسبقة. ثالثا، يجب تعزيز القنوات الإنسانية وحمايتها. رابعا،
force, we must implement confidence-building measures. Fifth, we must establish mechanisms for regional dialogue that include all stakeholders. These aren't simply aspirations, but are requirements needed to achieve peace. Madam President, we cannot ignore the humanitarian